My son-in-law didn't know I was the one paying his $7,400 a month mortgage, and when he screamed at me to get out of my own daughter's house, his face red, his finger pointing at the door, I didn't cry, I didn't argue, I just said, "Okay," and I meant it. Let me back up. My name is Miriam. I'm 63 years old, recently retired after 31 years as a hospital administrator, and I raised my daughter Brooke on my own after her father walked out when she was 4. It was just the two of us for a long time. We ate cereal for dinner more nights than I care to admit. I drove her to school in a car that overheated every summer. I worked double shifts to pay for her college applications, her prom dress, her first apartment deposit. Everything I did for her. I'm not saying that for sympathy. I'm saying it because it's important. It's the foundation of everything that came after. Brooke met her husband Trace at 28. He was charming in that loud, self-assured way that I've learned to be suspicious of as I've gotten older. He had big plans, he said. He was always on the verge of something. A business deal, a promotion, an investment that was about to pay off enormous returns. The details changed every time I saw him, but the energy was always the same, that restless, electric certainty that he was special, and the world had simply not caught up yet. I tried to love him for Brooke's sake, and in the beginning I managed something close to it. They got married 2 years later. Small ceremony, backyard of a friend's house, and I paid for most of it, because Trace's investment returns had not yet materialized. I didn't bring it up. I wrote the check, and I smiled, and I watched my daughter dance in a dress I'd helped her pick out, and I was genuinely happy for her. Then she called me 11 months later and told me they were in trouble. Not the marriage, or not yet, the finances. Trace had quit his job to pursue a real estate venture that had quietly collapsed. They were 3 months behind on their apartment rent. The landlord had sent the first formal notice. Brooke was pregnant. I was 60 at the time. I had just put in my retirement notice at the hospital, planning to start drawing on my savings and finally breathing a little. Instead, I drove to their apartment with a casserole and a very calm expression, sat down at their kitchen table, and asked to see the numbers. Trace wasn't there. Brooke said he had a meeting. I looked at the electricity bill on the counter and the stack of unopened envelopes by the door, and I didn't say a word about him. The numbers were bad, not catastrophic, but bad in the particular way that happens when one person doesn't tell the other person what's really going on until the wall is already starting to crack. They owed more than I expected. And with a baby coming, their apartment, a 1-bedroom in a complex with thin walls and a parking lot that flooded every time it rained, was not going to work. I made a decision that night. I told Brooke I would help them find a house. Something with a yard, something real, something where a child could grow up with a little space. She cried and said she couldn't accept that, and I said I wasn't asking her permission. I was telling her what was going to happen. What I did not do was tell Trace. Not because I wanted to deceive him. I want to be honest about my thinking at the time. I told myself it was simpler, that the details of the finances were between me and my daughter, that I didn't want to create awkwardness, that he was proud, and it would go down easier if we didn't make a big announcement of it. Maybe that was true. Maybe I also, somewhere in the back of my mind, wanted to see what kind of man he would be if he thought he was the one holding things up. I'm not proud of that, but I'm being honest. I found them a house in a suburb 40 minutes from the city. Good school district, 3 bedrooms, a small backyard with a peach tree that had obviously been there for decades. The mortgage on it was $7,400 a month. That included property taxes and insurance. It was more than I had planned. But I walked through that house, and I stood under that peach tree, and I thought about a grandchild running around out there, and I made the call. I set up the payment so it came directly from my account. Brooke knew. We told Trace that the mortgage was being handled. Brooke's word, not mine. While he got back on his feet. He didn't ask follow-up questions. I noticed that. He didn't ask where the money was coming from, who was handling it, what the terms were, when it would need to change. He just accepted it the way some people accept good weather, without curiosity and without gratitude, as if it was simply their due. He moved into their house and he started referring to it as his house within the first month. I heard him on the phone once telling someone the property value had already gone up since he bought it. I was standing in the kitchen washing dishes when he said it. I kept washing dishes. I moved into the 3rd bedroom 6 months after they settled in. The baby, a girl they named Abby, had just been born, and Brooke asked me to come help. She wasn't sleeping. Trace was working again, a sales position he'd found, and he travelled frequently enough that Brooke was essentially alone with a newborn 5 days out of 7. I said yes without hesitation. I packed up my apartment, put most of my furniture in storage, and moved my life into a room that shared a wall with the baby's nursery. I was up 3 times a night half the time. I did the grocery runs. I made dinners. I held Abby while Brooke slept for 2 hours in the afternoon. And sometimes I would sit in the rocking chair by the window with that baby on my chest and think that this was exactly where I was supposed to be. For a while it was good, hard, but good. Trace was around on weekends and he could be warm when he wanted to be. He'd grill on Saturdays and tell long stories and make Brooke laugh in that specific way she'd had since she was a teenager. Head thrown back, completely unguarded. I held on to those moments. But gradually, something shifted. It started small. Trace made a comment at dinner about how having me there cramped the atmosphere. He said it like a joke. I let it go. Then he started making remarks about my habits, that I kept the kitchen too organized, that I moved things, that I ran the dishwasher too often, things that had never been issues before. I adjusted. I moved more quietly through the house. I started eating earlier so I wasn't at the table when he got home. Then his parents started visiting more. His mother, a woman named Dolores, made no secret of the fact that she did not like me. She would come for the weekend and rearrange things in the kitchen and talk to Brooke about how important it was for a young family to have their own space. She said, their own space, the way people say a thing when they mean something else entirely. Trace would listen to his mother and nod, and then he would look at me a certain way, not hostile exactly, but assessing, like he was doing math. One Thursday evening in November, I came home from picking Abby up from her little preschool program to find Trace sitting at the kitchen table with his arms crossed. Brooke was standing by the sink with her back to the room. She didn't turn around when I came in. Trace looked at me and said, "We need to talk about the living situation." I set my bag down on the counter. Abby ran past me toward the living room. I watched her go and then I turned back to him and I waited. He said that his parents were looking to downsize, that they'd been in a big house for 30 years, and it was getting to be too much for them, that it would make much more sense, financially, logistically, for the whole family, if they moved into the 3rd bedroom instead of renting a place nearby. I looked at Brooke. She was still looking at the window above the sink. I asked her if this was what she wanted. She didn't answer immediately. That pause told me everything I needed to know, and also broke something very quiet inside me that I don't think I fully repaired. Then Trace stood up. He was taller than me by about 8 inches, and he had a way of using that height when he was making a point. He said, "Look, Miriam, I don't want to be harsh, but you have to understand, you being here, it's a lot. You're always in the middle of everything. My kids." And he said that, my kids, as if Abby weren't also Brooke's, as if I hadn't been the one doing school pickup. My kids need to grow up with their own family around them, not, and he paused and looked for the right word, a dependent. That word, dependent. I had paid $7,400 a month for 22 months. I had done the math many times since that evening. $224,000, plus the groceries, plus the utilities I'd quietly absorbed whenever the bills came in, and I could see Brooke's face get tight at the table, plus Abby's preschool fees for the past 6 months, which I'd been paying directly to the school because Brooke had mentioned once offhandedly that they were a stretch. A dependent. Brooke finally turned around. Her eyes were wet. She said, "Mom, maybe it would be better if you found a place nearby. We'd still see each other all the time." I looked at her for a long moment. Then I said, "Okay." Just that, okay. Trace looked slightly surprised, like he'd expected a fight. Then he recovered and nodded and said something about how he thought this was the right move for everyone. I went to my room. I sat on the edge of my bed and I looked at the wall and I thought very carefully about everything I knew about that house. Here is what Trace did not know. When I had arranged the mortgage 22 months ago, I had done it the right way, the careful way, the way you do things when you've spent 30 years managing hospital budgets, and you understand that paperwork matters and that verbal agreements are worth nothing at all. My name was on the loan, not as a co-signer, but as the primary borrower. Brooke was listed as well. Trace was not on the mortgage at all because at the time of the application, his credit was not in a position to help. It would only have hurt. He had agreed to this, distantly, the way he agreed to things that didn't fully register. He had been living in a house that was in my name and my daughter's name for almost 2 years, and he had never once asked to see the paperwork. I also happened to know, because I had looked into it carefully before saying a single word to anyone, that under the terms of the loan, if I stopped making payments, the house would go into default. Trace's credit would not be directly impacted, since his name was not on the loan, but the house would be unlivable for them without someone making that mortgage payment. And whoever took over that payment would need to qualify for it on their own, which Trace, on his current salary, could not do. I didn't do anything that night. I slept 8 hours, which surprised me. In the morning I made coffee, and I helped Abby with her cereal, and I kissed her on top of her head, and I went back to my room and I made some phone calls. The first call was to my real estate attorney, a woman I'd worked with twice before. I explained the situation. She explained my options. We talked for 45 minutes, and by the end of it, I had a clear picture of exactly what I was going to do. The second call was to a moving company. I scheduled them for the following Saturday. I asked for the full pack and move service. The third call was to an apartment complex about 3 miles away. I had toured it once 2 years ago when I was deciding whether to move in with Brooke. It had a second-floor unit with a small balcony and a very quiet parking lot. They had an availability. I put down the deposit that afternoon. I told Brooke that Thursday evening. I said I'd found a place, I'd scheduled movers, and I'd be out by Saturday afternoon. Her face did something complicated that I didn't have the energy to interpret fully right then. She said, "That fast?" I said yes. She said, "Mum, I didn't mean we weren't trying to push you out tomorrow." I said I knew that. I said it was fine. I said I thought a clean transition was better for everyone. I watched her face while I said it, and I could see her trying to figure out what I meant by that, and I didn't help her figure it out. Friday evening, Trace came home from work and saw the boxes stacked in the hallway outside my room. He paused. He looked at them for a moment. Then he came into the kitchen where I was making Abby's dinner, and he said, in a slightly different tone than he'd used Thursday, "You're really moving out this weekend?" I said yes. He said, "And the mortgage, you've made arrangements." There it was, the first time in 22 months he had asked me a direct question about the mortgage. I turned away from the stove and looked at him. I said, "I've contacted the lender. There will need to be a conversation about the loan going forward, since my name is the primary name on it." I watched his face change. It was subtle, just a tightening around the eyes, a very slight shift in how he was standing. He said, "What does that mean exactly?" I said, "It means that if I stop making payments, the loan goes into default. And since you're not on the loan, you'll need to either refinance in your own name or make other arrangements. I'd suggest talking to the bank soon. These things can take time." He said, "I'm not on the loan." I said, "No, you weren't in a position to be at the time. Brooke is, though. She can walk you through it." And then I turned back to the stove because Abby's pasta was about to boil over. The silence behind me lasted about 4 seconds. Then I heard him walk out of the kitchen. I heard him and Brooke talking in their bedroom for a long time that night. I couldn't make out the words, which was fine. I didn't need them. The movers came Saturday morning at 8 o'clock. They were efficient and cheerful, and they had everything in the truck by noon. I went room by room one last time. My bathroom, the closet that still had the smell of cedar from the liner I'd put in, the window above my bed where the light came in at a particular angle in the early morning that I had genuinely loved. I stopped in the doorway of Abby's room. She was at the kitchen table eating crackers. I could hear her singing something to herself, a little tuneless song she'd made up about a dog she wanted and didn't have yet. I stood there in the doorway for a moment and I let myself feel it. All of it, the grief and the love and the anger and the strangeness of being 63 years old and still being surprised by how people can be. Then I picked up the last bag from my room and I carried it out to my car. Brooke walked me to the driveway. She looked like she hadn't slept. She hugged me for a long time and said she was sorry. And I told her that I loved her and that I wasn't going anywhere, just 3 miles down the road, and that Abby could visit me on weekends and we'd bake things and watch movies and everything would be fine. I meant all of that. I still mean it. I did not tell her then what I'd already set in motion. I'm not sure she needed to know all of it right away. What I had done with my attorney was begin the process of formally notifying the lender of my intent to exit the loan. There were proper procedures for this. Brooke had been informed, legally and in writing, that she would need to address the mortgage situation within 90 days. Trace, as a non-party to the loan, was informed through her. They could refinance if they qualified, they could sell the house, or they could work out another arrangement. But my responsibility for that mortgage was ending. I heard through Brooke about 3 weeks later that Trace had gone to 2 different banks about refinancing in his own name. Both had declined him. He had not been managing his own credit carefully in the years I'd been absorbing the mortgage, and the picture was not pretty. Brooke was on the loan and theoretically could refinance with just her name. But her income alone, she'd gone back to work part-time after Abby started preschool, did not qualify her for a loan of that size. They had to sell the house. Brooke told me this on a Sunday afternoon at my new apartment. She was sitting on my couch with Abby asleep across her lap, and she said it quietly, like she was confessing something. She said they'd found a smaller place about 20 minutes away, that it was actually fine, that the school district wasn't as good. But Abby was still little and there was time to figure things out. I asked her how she felt. She said, "I feel like an idiot." I said she wasn't an idiot. I said she'd been in love with someone and had wanted it to work, and that wasn't stupidity, that was just being human, and I had done exactly the same thing at her age with her father, and I had zero room to judge. She looked at me for a long time, then she said, "Did you know this was going to happen?" I thought about that. I said, I knew that what I was doing was real, and I knew he hadn't bothered to understand what was real. She nodded slowly, then she looked out the window, then she said, "He called you a dependent." I said I remembered. She said, "He told his mother that he'd finally gotten you out of the house, that he put his foot down and handled it." I looked at my granddaughter asleep on the couch, with her mouth slightly open and her small hand curled under her chin, and I thought about the peach tree in the backyard of that house, which I had genuinely loved and was a little sad to leave behind. I told Brooke that it was going to be okay, that she and Abby were okay, and that was the thing that mattered to me. I meant that completely. Trace never apologized. I didn't expect him to. Some people never develop the capacity to understand what they've lost until it's already been gone long enough that the apology would feel hollow anyway. What I know is this. I spent 63 years learning how to take care of myself and the people I love. I learned how to read paperwork and ask follow-up questions and think past the next 6 months. I learned that generosity is a gift you give freely, not a loan that someone else gets to call permanent. And I learned, a long time before that November evening in the kitchen, that the people who call you a burden are almost always the ones who couldn't carry a single thing without you. I have a balcony now. It's small. I have 2 chairs out there and a little table, and I drink my coffee there every morning when the weather is decent. Abby comes over on Saturdays and we bake banana bread, and she tells me about things at school with the kind of detail only a 4-year-old would think was important. Who sat next to whom at lunch, what colour the new classroom rug was, whether the hamster had been given a satisfactory name. Last week she climbed up into my lap on the balcony and looked out at the parking lot below and said with complete seriousness, "Grandma, your house is small but it smells good." I held her a little tighter and I said, "I know, baby, that's exactly how I like it." I keep thinking about that word. Dependent. Trace said it the way people say something when they want it to land. Slowly, with a pause before it. Like he'd been saving it up, and I stood there in my daughter's kitchen, in a house I had been paying for every single month for nearly 2 years, and I let it land. I didn't argue. I didn't correct him. I just let him have the moment, because I already knew something he didn't. That's the thing about doing the right thing quietly, without announcement. People can't see it, so they start to believe their own version of events. Trace had told himself a story, that he was the one holding the family together, that he had been gracious enough to allow me into his home, that he was now being strong and decisive by asking me to leave. He believed that story completely. And honestly, that was his first real problem. Not the arrogance, exactly. The incuriosity. He had never once asked whose name was on that mortgage. He had never once looked at where the money actually came from. A person with genuine good sense, not just confidence, but real discernment, asks those questions, not out of suspicion, but because understanding the full picture is how you avoid walking off a cliff while feeling certain you're on solid ground. I don't say this to be cruel about him. I say it because I've spent 63 years learning the difference between looking capable and actually being capable. Real capability means you do the hard work of understanding your own situation. It means you read the paperwork. It means you ask the follow-up question, even when the answer might be uncomfortable. Trace never developed that habit, and nobody in his life had ever required it of him. That's a failure of character, but it's also a failure of the people who let him coast. What I did, paying that mortgage, moving in, making dinners, doing school pickup, none of it was martyrdom. I want to be clear about that. I did those things because I love my daughter and I love Abby, and because love without action is just sentiment. It costs nothing and means about as much. The strength that comes from genuinely showing up, from doing hard things without needing anyone to notice or applaud you, that's not something you're born with. I built it slowly, over decades, starting with those cereal for dinner nights when Brooke was small and I was scared, and I got up and did the next thing anyway. That's what I want Abby to understand someday when she's old enough. Not the story about the mortgage, exactly, but the thing underneath it. That integrity isn't about being recognized for what you do. It's about doing it correctly even when no one's watching, even when the person benefiting from your effort is calling you a burden to your face. You make your decisions from the clearest part of yourself, not from anger, not from ego, not from the need to win, and then you live with them quietly and completely. Brooke asked me once if I'd planned it. I told her the truth. I had planned to be careful. I had planned to protect myself legally from the very beginning, not out of suspicion, but because I know how the world works, and I know that people's feelings change and paperwork doesn't. That's not cynicism, that's just 63 years of paying attention. The peach tree is probably blooming right now in that backyard. Someone else's children will grow up around it. I hope they appreciate it. I have my balcony, I have my coffee in the morning, I have a 4-year-old who tells me my apartment smells good, which is the only review that has ever mattered to me. That's enough. That has always been enough.